Daniel was a quiet man who lived alone on the edge of town. His farm was small but full of life. Horses were his pride, and he cared for them with patience every day. The sound of hooves on the ground and the smell of fresh hay were part of his daily life. For years he had lived with only the animals for company. His days were simple and his nights were calm, but sometimes he felt a heavy silence in his home. He was used to it, but deep inside he wished for something more. He never said it aloud, but loneliness often sat with him like an old shadow. One cold evening, Daniel stepped outside to check the barn before going to sleep. It was his habit to make sure the doors were locked, the lamps were turned off, and the horses were safe. The air was cool and the wind carried the smell of damp earth. As he walked across the yard, the moonlight guided his steps. The barn stood tall against the night sky, its wooden frame creaking softly. Daniel carried a lantern with him, the warm glow of the flame lighting his way. He thought it would be a normal night like any other, but what he found inside the barn changed everything. When he pushed the barn doors open, he expected the horses to be resting. Most of them were, but their eyes were focused on one corner of the barn. Daniel noticed their calm but curious behavior. Horses often reacted strongly to strangers, yet they seemed unusually gentle that night. His eyes followed their gaze, and then he saw her. A young woman was lying on a pile of hay, wrapped in an old blanket. Her hair was messy, and her clothes looked worn from travel. She was not moving much, just breathing softly as if she had finally found a safe place to rest. For a moment, Daniel thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but as he stepped closer, he realized it was real. He stopped a few feet away, unsure what to do. His first thought was that she might be in trouble or hiding from something. But she looked peaceful, not like someone who meant harm. Daniel's heart softened. He saw her face under the lantern's light. It was tired and pale, but there was also a quiet beauty in it. She looked like someone who had carried too many burdens for too long. The blanket she used was thin, barely enough to keep out the cold. Daniel knew she must have been desperate to choose a barn as her shelter. Yet the horses stood close to her, almost as if they were keeping watch. That made Daniel pause. Animals had a way of sensing people's hearts, and if his horses trusted her, maybe he should too. Daniel set the lantern down carefully and crouched beside her. He did not want to scare her, so he spoke in a low and gentle voice. "Miss, are you all right?" She stirred slightly but did not wake. He waited a moment, then tried again, a little louder. Her eyes opened slowly, blinking against the light. She looked frightened at first, her body stiff as if ready to run. But then she noticed his calm face and the kindness in his tone. Her breathing slowed, though her eyes still held uncertainty. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice weak. "I didn't mean to cause trouble. I just needed a place to rest." Daniel studied her for a moment. She looked too fragile to be a threat. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the kind that came from more than just a long day. It was the exhaustion of someone who had been running for a long time, searching for safety. "You're not in trouble," Daniel said softly. "But this isn't a safe place to sleep. The nights get cold and the barn isn't warm enough. You could get sick." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders as if she already knew that but had no other choice. Daniel felt a pull in his chest. He could have asked her to leave, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the way the horses stood near her, or perhaps it was the quiet plea in her eyes. He could not turn her away. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated for a second before answering. "Emily." Her voice carried both fear and hope, as though she was unsure if he would believe her. Daniel nodded. "All right, Emily, you don't need to be afraid. I'm Daniel. This is my farm." For a moment, silence filled the barn. The sound of the horses shifting their hooves was the only thing that broke it. Emily looked down ashamed. "I didn't want to bother anyone," she whispered. I didn't know where else to go." The barn looked warm and safe. Daniel listened without interrupting. He could hear the honesty in her words. She was not making excuses. She was simply telling the truth. Daniel stood and reached for a small basket near the barn door. He always kept bread, fruit, and a flask of water nearby for long nights of work. He brought it over and placed it gently beside her. "You look hungry," he said. Emily looked at the basket, her eyes widening slightly. She shook her head at first, but her stomach betrayed her with a low growl. Daniel smiled kindly. "Go on, it's all right." Slowly, Emily reached for the bread. Her hands trembled as she tore off a piece and ate it carefully, almost like she had forgotten what kindness felt like. Daniel watched quietly, not wanting to overwhelm her. It was a small act, but he could see how much it meant to her. As she ate, Daniel leaned back against the wooden wall of the barn, thinking. He had lived alone for so long that this moment felt unusual, almost unreal. Yet he knew one thing. He could not let her wander off into the night. The roads were dangerous and the cold was harsh. Emily needed rest, safety, and maybe even someone to trust. For now he could give her that. He looked at her again, noticing how the lantern light softened her features. She looked less like a stranger and more like someone who had been lost and finally found a pause in her journey. "You can stay here tonight," Daniel said after a while, "but tomorrow we'll figure out something better." Emily's eyes filled with gratitude, though she did not say much. She simply nodded, holding the bread close. Daniel could see how much relief those words gave her. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The barn, once just a place for animals, now held something more. A quiet connection between two people who had never expected to meet. Daniel didn't know what the future would bring, but that night, he knew he had made the right choice. He stayed a little longer, making sure she was comfortable. The horses settled down too, their calm presence filling the barn with peace. Emily wrapped herself tighter in the blanket, her eyes finally closing with safety she hadn't felt in a long time. Daniel picked up the lantern and walked back to his house. As he stepped outside, he looked back once more at the barn. Something about this night felt different. It was the beginning of a story he never thought would be written on his farm. And though he couldn't explain why, Daniel felt his loneliness lift just a little. He had found someone in his barn, and deep inside he knew this meeting was not an accident. The next morning, Daniel rose early, as he always did. The sun was just climbing above the hills, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and pink. He walked across the yard toward the barn, his boots crunching against the gravel. His mind kept returning to what he had seen the night before. He still wondered if he had dreamed it, but as he reached the barn doors and pushed them open, he saw her. Emily was still there, sitting quietly on a bale of hay. She looked a little more awake now, her blanket folded neatly beside her. The horses moved around her calmly, and Daniel noticed again how at ease they were with her presence. It was unusual, but it made him feel more certain that letting her stay had been the right thing. "Good morning," Daniel said, his voice steady but warm. Emily looked up quickly, almost startled, but then she gave a small nod. "Good morning," she replied softly. Her voice was stronger than the night before, though still shy. Daniel stepped inside and began his routine. He filled the buckets with fresh water and poured feed into the troughs. Emily watched quietly at first, then stood and offered to help. She seemed hesitant, as if unsure whether he would accept her help. Daniel smiled and handed her a small scoop. "You can give the feed to Star," he said, pointing to the brown mare with a white mark on her forehead. Emily took the scoop carefully and approached the horse. Star sniffed her hand and then ate calmly, as if she had known Emily for years. Daniel noticed how natural Emily seemed with the animal, and it made him curious. After finishing with the horses, Daniel sat on a wooden stool near the barn door. Emily stayed near him, holding the empty scoop in her hands. She looked nervous, as if she expected him to ask her to leave. Instead, he asked the question that had been on his mind since last night. "Where were you going before you came here?" Emily hesitated. Her eyes dropped to the ground and she traced small circles in the dirt with her shoe. "Nowhere, really," she said quietly. "I've been moving from place to place for weeks. Sometimes I find a shelter. Sometimes I sleep outside. Last night was too cold and I saw the barn. I thought maybe I could rest here just for a little while." Daniel listened closely, his arms resting on his knees. He could hear the truth in her voice. She wasn't trying to hide or pretend. She was just tired. "Do you have family?" he asked gently. Emily shook her head. "Not anymore. It's just me." Her words carried a weight that made Daniel's heart ache. He didn't press her for details. He could see that talking about it was hard enough for her. Instead, he nodded slowly and said, "You don't have to explain everything right now. I just want to know you're safe." Emily looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. She wasn't used to someone caring without demanding answers. Daniel stood and stretched his back. "Come inside the house," he said. "You can have a proper breakfast. Bread and water are not enough." Emily froze for a moment, unsure if she had heard him right. "Inside?" she asked. "Yes," Daniel replied calmly. "You're my guest now." Emily followed him hesitantly, her steps small and careful, as though she didn't want to break whatever fragile trust had formed between them. When they reached the farmhouse, Daniel opened the door and stepped aside for her to enter first. The house was simple but clean. Wooden furniture, a stone fireplace, and shelves lined with books and tools filled the rooms. It smelled faintly of coffee and fresh wood. Emily looked around with quiet wonder, as though she hadn't been inside a home in a long time. Daniel motioned for her to sit at the table while he prepared food. He fried eggs in a pan, cut slices of bread, and poured hot tea into 2 cups. Emily sat silently, her hands folded in her lap. When he placed the plate in front of her, she whispered, "Thank you," her voice almost trembling. She ate slowly, savoring each bite as though it were a gift. Daniel watched her with a mix of concern and curiosity. He could tell she wasn't used to being taken care of. "You don't have to thank me," he said gently. "Everyone deserves a warm meal." Emily smiled faintly, but her eyes glistened. She quickly looked down, not wanting him to see. After breakfast, Daniel went about his daily work, and Emily offered to help again. She cleaned the dishes, swept the floor, and even gathered eggs from the chicken coop. She worked carefully, making sure she did everything right. Daniel noticed how eager she was to be useful. She didn't want to feel like a burden. In the afternoon, they sat outside under the shade of a tree. Daniel leaned back on a wooden chair while Emily sat on the grass, watching the horses graze in the field. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was gentle, like 2 people who didn't need to fill the air with words. Eventually, Emily began to talk. She told him bits and pieces about her journey. She had traveled through different towns, always looking for a place where she might belong. Sometimes people helped her, but often they turned her away. She had grown used to moving on, never staying too long in one place. "I don't expect people to care," she said softly. "It's easier that way." Daniel listened, his expression calm. "Maybe," he said slowly. "But sometimes people do care. You just have to find the right ones." Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with quiet gratitude. She didn't say anything, but her heart felt a little lighter. As the sun began to set, Daniel noticed how the farm felt different with Emily around. The silence that once filled his days was replaced by a gentle presence. It wasn't loud or demanding, it was just there, soft and steady. He realized he didn't mind it at all. In fact, he welcomed it. That evening, they shared another meal together. Emily had helped prepare it, chopping vegetables while Daniel cooked. They sat at the table, eating quietly but comfortably. Afterward, Emily offered to sleep in the barn again, but Daniel hesitated. "It's warmer in the house," he said. "There's a spare room you can use." Emily looked uncertain, but after a moment she agreed. Daniel showed her the small room with a bed covered in clean sheets. Emily stood at the doorway, almost overwhelmed. "This is too much," she whispered. "It's not," Daniel replied firmly. "Everyone needs rest." That night, as Emily lay in the bed, she stared at the ceiling, feeling a strange mix of emotions. She was safe, but part of her was afraid to believe it. She had been let down too many times before. Still, as she pulled the blanket around her, she realized she was beginning to trust Daniel. For the first time in months, she closed her eyes without fear. Meanwhile, in the next room, Daniel sat by the fireplace, thinking. He didn't know why fate had brought Emily to his barn, but he was certain of one thing. He would not let her wander off into the cold again. Something told him her story was just beginning, and somehow he was meant to be a part of it. The farm was quiet, the horses resting peacefully, and the night air filled with the soft sound of crickets. But inside the farmhouse, a new story was unfolding, one of kindness, trust, and the possibility of healing. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the firelight flickering across his face. He thought about the way Emily had smiled that evening, shy but real. It had been a long time since he had seen a smile like that in his home. For the first time in years, Daniel did not feel like a man living alone on the edge of town. He felt like something had shifted, like a door had opened that he never expected. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight he felt hope. The next days passed quietly on the farm, but nothing felt the same for Daniel. He had been used to waking up to silence, hearing only the sound of roosters and the creak of wooden doors. Now there was another presence in his home. When he walked into the kitchen, he would sometimes find Emily already awake, boiling water for tea or folding the blanket neatly from her bed. She did not act like a guest who expected everything to be done for her. Instead, she moved carefully, trying to help in every small way she could. At first, Daniel told her she didn't have to do anything, but she insisted. It was her way of showing gratitude. The farm began to feel different with her around. There was laughter again, though quiet and shy at first. Daniel found himself talking more than he had in years. He would share small stories about the horses, how Star had once run free in the fields, or how the foal in the barn liked to follow him everywhere like a shadow. Emily listened with bright eyes, smiling in ways that softened the sadness she carried. She asked questions about farm life, about how long he had lived there, and about what it was like to care for animals every day. Daniel answered patiently, happy to see her interest. It reminded him that he had once enjoyed telling stories, but over time, he had simply stopped because no one was there to listen. Emily also showed her own talents. She had a gentle way with the horses that Daniel admired. One morning, when he was struggling to calm the foal, Emily stepped forward without fear. She spoke softly, her hand steady, and within minutes the foal settled against her side. Daniel stood back, amazed. "You have a gift," he said quietly. Emily looked down, embarrassed, and shook her head. "I just understand them," she whispered. "Animals don't judge. They just feel." Those words stayed with Daniel for the rest of the day. He realized she wasn't just talking about the horses. She was talking about herself too. The days blended into a rhythm. They worked together, cooked together, and sometimes simply sat in silence while the fire crackled in the fireplace. For Daniel, this was new. He had lived alone so long that sharing his space had once felt unthinkable. Yet now it felt natural. He began to notice small things. The way Emily hummed when she swept the floor, the way her eyes lit up when she saw a horse running freely in the pasture, and the way she laughed quietly at his simple jokes. These details made the farm feel warmer, alive in a way it hadn't been in years. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Daniel suggested they take a walk. Emily hesitated, but then agreed. They walked along the fence line, the golden light casting long shadows on the grass. The air smelled of fresh hay, and the distant sound of crickets filled the silence. Daniel asked her gently about her past. Not too much, but enough to show he cared. Emily opened up little by little. She spoke of towns she had passed through, of nights spent under the open sky, and of the many times she had been told to move along. Her voice carried no anger, just a tired acceptance. Daniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said only, "You're safe here. You don't need to keep moving anymore." Emily's steps slowed, and she looked at him with tears shining in her eyes. She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. Her silence said everything. As the weeks passed, the bond between them grew stronger. Emily began to relax more, her shoulders no longer as tense as when she first arrived. She learned Daniel's habits, like how he always drank tea before bed and how he checked the barn one last time every night. She started to leave small touches around the house, a flower in a jar on the kitchen table, a folded cloth on the windowsill. Daniel noticed them all, though he never said anything. These touches made the farmhouse feel less like a place of routine and more like a home. The townspeople soon noticed Emily too. When Daniel went into town for supplies, Emily sometimes went with him. At first, people were curious, whispering questions. Daniel ignored them, but Emily felt the stares. She held herself with quiet dignity, though inside she feared she didn't belong. Daniel, however, walked beside her with calm confidence, as if to show the world she was under his protection. That simple act gave her courage. Back on the farm, Emily took more responsibility. She cooked meals, tended the chickens, and even tried baking bread. The first loaf was heavy and hard, and she laughed nervously when Daniel tried to chew it. But instead of complaining, he smiled and said, "It's not bad for a first try." Encouraged, she tried again, and soon the house smelled of fresh bread every few days. These small successes built her confidence. She no longer felt like a stranger passing through. She began to feel rooted. Daniel also changed. He found himself smiling more often, speaking more openly, and looking forward to each day. His loneliness, which had once felt like a heavy weight, began to lift. He realized how much he had missed companionship. He would catch himself watching Emily as she worked in the garden or brushed the horses, and he felt a quiet warmth in his chest. It wasn't just kindness anymore. It was something deeper, something he hadn't expected. One evening, a sudden summer storm rolled over the farm. The sky darkened and rain poured heavily against the roof. Lightning flashed, followed by the loud crack of thunder. Emily was in the kitchen when the storm hit, and Daniel saw the fear in her eyes. She gripped the edge of the table, trembling slightly. "I don't like storms," she admitted softly. Daniel understood. He walked over, lit a lamp, and placed it on the table to chase away the shadows. "You're not alone," he said gently. He sat with her through the storm, telling simple stories to distract her from the noise. Emily slowly relaxed, her breathing calming. That night, something unspoken passed between them, a trust that went beyond words. When the storm finally ended, Daniel walked her to the small room where she slept. She paused at the doorway and looked at him. For the first time, she said, "Thank you for everything. You've given me more than anyone has in a long time." Her words were soft but powerful. Daniel nodded, unable to say much, but his eyes said what he could not. After she closed the door, he stood in the hallway for a long time, thinking about how much had changed in such a short time. By now, Emily was no longer just a guest in his house. She was part of his life, part of his days and nights. The farm felt brighter, fuller, and Daniel knew he did not want to return to the silence of the past. He had not planned for this, but life had brought Emily to his barn, and now she was bringing light into his world. As he sat by the fireplace later that night, Daniel realized he was not only caring for her, she was also caring for him in ways he had never expected. The stormy night had passed, but the memory of it stayed with both Daniel and Emily. For Daniel, it was the first time in years he had sat with someone through the fear and uncertainty of thunder and rain. For Emily, it was the first time in a long while she felt safe during something that once terrified her. That small moment built something stronger between them, something neither of them had planned but both quietly welcomed. The next morning, the sky was clear again. The fields glistened with raindrops and the barn smelled fresh from the storm. Emily stepped outside with a soft smile, looking at the wide stretch of land as the horses trotted happily in the pasture. Daniel noticed how her face looked different now. There was still some sadness hidden in her eyes, but there was also light, a kind of peace that hadn't been there when he first found her in the barn. He realized how much she had changed in just a short time on the farm, and how much he himself had changed too. They settled into a routine together. Emily helped more with the chores, waking early to feed the chickens or sweep the porch before Daniel even asked. She seemed determined to prove her worth, though Daniel had never once doubted it. Sometimes he would watch her quietly, noticing the way she carried herself, still cautious but also growing stronger. He admired her spirit, and he knew she was not just surviving anymore. She was slowly learning how to live again. One evening, dark clouds gathered once more, and the wind howled through the trees. Emily stiffened when she heard the first rumbles of thunder. Daniel noticed and said calmly, "The barn isn't safe when the storm is this strong. She'll stay in the house tonight." Emily nodded, though she looked nervous. When the rain began to beat against the windows, she sat in her room alone, trying to calm herself. But the lightning grew brighter and the thunder louder. Her heart raced, and she could not shake the fear that had lived in her for years. Finally, she rose and walked down the hallway. She knocked softly on Daniel's door. When Daniel opened it, he saw the worry in her face. She spoke quietly, almost apologetic. "Can I sit with you for a while? Just until it passes." He stepped aside without hesitation and motioned her to come in. The room was warm from the fireplace, and the glow of the flames cast gentle shadows on the walls. Emily sat in the chair by the fire while Daniel remained nearby. They spoke softly, about small things at first. The horses, the garden, even the bread she had baked earlier that day. Slowly, their words grew deeper. Daniel found himself sharing pieces of his own life he had never spoken about to anyone. He told her about his parents who had once owned the farm, about how he had taken over after they passed, and about how the silence of the house had become his only companion for so many years. Emily listened closely, her eyes never leaving his. For the first time, Daniel spoke openly about his loneliness. He admitted that he had learned to live with it, but not without cost. Emily nodded with understanding, because she knew what it meant to feel unseen and forgotten. Then Emily shared more of her own story. She told him about the nights she had wandered alone, about the times she had been turned away from shelter, and about the moments when she wondered if she would ever find a place to belong. Her voice trembled, but Daniel's presence gave her strength to continue. She admitted that when he had first found her in the barn, she had been prepared to be thrown out again. Instead, he had shown kindness. That night, she said softly. Was the first time in a long time I felt like someone cared if I stayed or left. Daniel's heart tightened at her words. He realized how close she had been to giving up hope. He leaned forward slightly and said, "You don't have to leave anymore. Not unless you want to. This is your home now if you'll accept it." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. For the first time, she believed him. The storm outside raged on, but in that small room, both of them felt a calm they had been missing for years. As the night grew darker, Emily grew tired. Daniel offered her the bed, insisting he would take the chair, but she refused. She stayed by the fire, resting her head on her arms. The storm slowly faded, and when morning came, Emily was still there, asleep in the chair. Daniel watched her for a moment before covering her with a blanket. It struck him how natural it felt to care for her, as if she had always been a part of his life. The days after that night deepened their bond. They shared not just work and meals, but also trust and quiet understanding. Emily began to laugh more freely, and Daniel found himself smiling without effort. The farm, once so silent, was now filled with warmth. Even the townspeople noticed the change in Daniel when he visited. He was no longer the quiet, withdrawn farmer they had known for years. He carried himself differently, with light in his eyes and a sense of purpose that had been missing. Emily, too, found herself growing in ways she had never imagined. She no longer felt like a guest who would leave one day. She felt rooted, like the farm had claimed her as its own. She took joy in the smallest things: the taste of fresh fruit from the orchard, the sound of rain tapping gently on the windows when she was safe inside, the warmth of the horses nuzzling her hands. Most of all, she cherished the sense of belonging that Daniel gave her, without asking for anything in return. One evening, as they sat together by the fireplace, Emily looked at Daniel and said, "You've given me more than a place to stay. You've given me a life again." Daniel did not answer right away. He simply looked at her, his eyes steady and kind. "And you," he said finally, "have given me something I thought I had lost, a reason to look forward to tomorrow." Their words hung in the air, gentle but powerful. Neither of them needed to say more. From that moment on, their connection was unshakable. What had begun as an act of kindness in a barn had grown into something far stronger. They were no longer two people surviving alone. They were two lives intertwined by trust, care, and a quiet kind of love that did not need grand gestures to be real. Emily no longer saw herself as a wanderer, and Daniel no longer saw himself as a lonely farmer. Together they had built a bond that storms could not break. That night, as Daniel watched the stars from the porch and Emily stood beside him, he realized something important. The farm was not just his anymore, it was theirs. The silence that once haunted him had been replaced by her laughter, her footsteps, and her presence. And though neither of them had planned for this, they both knew it was meant to be. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks slowly rolled into months. Life on the farm had settled into a new rhythm, one that neither Daniel nor Emily could have imagined when they first met. What had begun as a night of surprise in the barn had grown into a bond that filled both their lives with meaning. Daniel had always believed the farm would remain a quiet, lonely place, but now every morning carried a different kind of warmth. He would wake to the sound of light footsteps in the kitchen, or the smell of tea already steeping, or sometimes the soft humming of Emily as she prepared for the day. It was simple, but it was something his heart had longed for without ever admitting it. Emily, too, had changed. She no longer looked like the frightened, weary young woman who had curled up in hay that cold night. Her face was brighter, her smile more natural. She laughed more easily, spoke with more confidence, and carried herself with quiet strength. The farm gave her not just shelter, but also a sense of belonging. Each chore, each moment with the animals, and each meal shared with Daniel reminded her she was no longer wandering without direction. She had found her place. They worked side by side in everything. In the mornings, Daniel handled the heavy lifting while Emily took care of feeding and brushing the horses. She had grown especially close to Star, the mare with the white marking on her forehead. The horse followed her almost everywhere, nudging her shoulder for attention. Daniel often teased that Star had chosen Emily as her person, and Emily would smile, patting the horse gently. In the afternoons, they worked in the garden together. Emily had started planting flowers near the edge of the field, brightening the land with colors Daniel had never bothered to think about before. The farm was no longer just practical, it was beautiful. Evenings were their favorite time. They would sit on the porch watching the sunset, the sky painted in streaks of gold and red. Sometimes they spoke about their day, sometimes they sat in silence. But it was a silence filled with peace, not emptiness. Daniel realized how much he had come to look forward to those quiet evenings. The sound of Emily's laughter, the way she leaned back against the chair with her hair catching the last bit of sunlight. It all made the farm feel alive in a way it hadn't in years. The townspeople, once curious about Emily, slowly grew used to seeing her with Daniel. At first there had been whispers when they walked into town together, people wondering who she was and why she was with him. But over time, the whispers faded, replaced by nods and polite greetings. Some even noticed the change in Daniel. The farmer who had always kept to himself now smiled more, spoke more, and looked happier. They saw Emily as the reason for that change, and in a quiet way they respected it. One afternoon, Daniel returned from town with supplies and found Emily in the kitchen. She had flour on her face and laughter in her eyes. "I tried baking again," she said, holding up a loaf of bread. This time it was golden and soft, a far cry from her first heavy attempt. Daniel cut a slice and tasted it, nodding approvingly. "Perfect," he said simply, but the pride in his voice made Emily beam. These little victories mattered to her. They reminded her she had grown, that she was no longer the lost traveler who had stumbled into his barn. But it wasn't only Emily who had changed. Daniel himself had been transformed by her presence. He noticed himself looking forward to each day with new energy. He felt lighter, more hopeful. Where once the evenings felt long and empty, now they were filled with companionship. Sometimes he caught himself thinking about how different life might have been if Emily had never come to the barn that night. The thought made him shiver, because he could not imagine going back to the way things were before. Their bond deepened with each shared moment. They trusted each other in ways they had never trusted anyone before. One night, sitting by the fireplace, Daniel told Emily, "When I first found you, I thought I was just helping someone for a night. But it feels like life was helping me too. You gave me back something I didn't even know I had lost." Emily's eyes softened and she reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. "And you gave me something I thought I would never find again," she whispered. "A home." That night neither of them said much more. They didn't need to. The bond between them was no longer just kindness or gratitude, it was love, though neither rushed to put it into words. It was in the way Daniel made sure Emily never went hungry, in the way Emily cared for the animals as if they were her own, in the way they shared laughter over simple things. Love lived quietly in their daily life, steady and strong. Over time, Emily stopped sleeping in the spare room. It wasn't a sudden change, but a natural one. One evening, after another long day of work and laughter, she sat with Daniel by the fire until she grew too tired to walk down the hall. Daniel offered his bed, and though she hesitated at first, she eventually accepted. From that night on, she no longer slept alone. The house that had once been so silent now held the warmth of two people sharing not just space but life itself. The horses, the fields, the sunsets, all of it seemed brighter because they experienced it together. When storms came, Emily no longer trembled alone. Daniel was there, steady and strong. And when Daniel felt the weight of loneliness trying to creep back, Emily's laughter pushed it away. They had become each other's safe place, each other's reason to keep moving forward. Seasons passed and the farm thrived. Flowers bloomed, crops grew, and the animals thrived under their care. But the greatest change was not in the land. It was in the two people who had found each other in the most unexpected way. Emily no longer carried the look of someone ready to run. She belonged. And Daniel no longer looked like a man resigned to silence. He had found joy again. Sometimes, on quiet nights, Daniel would look at Emily as she rested beside him and think back to that first evening in the barn. He remembered the thin blanket, the tired eyes, and the fear in her voice when she apologized for being there. And then he looked at her now, peaceful, safe at home, and he marveled at how life could change in a single moment. He often whispered to himself, "It was meant to be." Emily too often thought about the journey that had led her there. She had walked through so many towns, faced so many rejections, and nearly lost hope. But fate had guided her to Daniel's farm, to his kindness, to a place where she was not only welcomed but cherished. She had found more than shelter. She had found family, love, and a life she never thought possible. And so the story that began with a frightened girl sleeping in a barn ended with two people sharing their lives, their home, and their hearts. Daniel no longer lived alone, and Emily no longer wandered without direction. Together they built something steady and strong. Each day was a new chapter in the story that neither of them had expected, but both were grateful for. The barn still stood at the edge of the field, holding the memory of that first meeting. The horses still walked gently where she had once slept, but now Emily no longer curled up in hay for warmth. She slept in Daniel's bed, not as a guest, not as someone passing through, but as his partner in life, his reason for hope, and the heart of the home they shared.